most often when we think about Jesus calling these first disciples, we're a little overwhelmed. We probably find ourselves asking, how on earth do they just drop everything like that and follow? I mean, I can hardly make it through a day without making a list. There are preparations to be made. There are things to attend to before you just run off on some lifelong escapade. It's overwhelming. And on top of that, we wonder, what do they know about this guy, right? He hasn't presented them with a CV or a resume or references. There are no reviews on rateyourrabbi.com. How do they trust him enough to do that? We think these things mainly because the stories we're most familiar with are from Mark and Matthew, who basically uses Mark almost word for word, and there's not much backstory given at all. So sometimes in our sanctified imaginations, we try to imagine, well, what must have been the reason for them trusting and leaving? Maybe it's something about Jesus' presence, right? Maybe there's something in his bearing and his voice, follow me, that they just are like, oh, this charismatic leader, we'll follow, we'll do anything. I've heard others speculate that maybe it's because most of the time when a teacher, remember rabbi at this point is not officially clergy. That doesn't happen till later. A rabbi is just a teacher. But when a rabbi or teacher is looking for disciples, usually they're looking for the cream of the crop, right? Like an exclusive school that will only take people with a certain GPA or certain scores on their standardized tests. And yet here, these disciples are as ordinary people, and a rabbi is asking them to follow. Maybe they are so honored that they can't help themselves. They have to follow. Wow, what an honor for a teacher to want me. Now, perhaps all of these things are true to some extent. But thankfully, with Luke's gospel, we don't have to speculate. We already know some of the backstory. We have this miraculous thing that's happening with this miraculous catch of fish. Simon/Peter/Simon Peter, when we're talking about them, we're talking about the same person, right? Sees this miracle, sees the fish just flock right to the net after they've been out fishing all night long and catching nothing. But there's even more to the backstory that I didn't read. In Luke 4, kind of in between the stuff that we talked about last week with the sermon in Nazareth in this episode, after the temptation, we get to, here we go. After leaving the synagogue where he had just been in Nazareth, Jesus entered Simon's house. Now Simon's mother-in-law was suffering from a high fever, and they asked him about her. Then he stood over her and rebuked the fever. I don't know if he did it like that, but however he did it. And it left her. Immediately she got up and began to serve them. Sounds like my grandmother. Feeling good. You want to eat dinner? As the sun was setting, all those who had any who were sick with various kinds of diseases brought them to him, and he laid his hands on each of them and cured them. At daybreak he departed. So we already know that by the time Jesus gets to Simon in the episode we just read, he's been to his house, he's healed his mother-in-law of a fever, he sat down to eat with them, broken bread with them, and he's healed other people who have come to the house to see him. It's no wonder that when Simon out on the boat sees Jesus come and Jesus climbs on the boat and says, Simon, put out a little ways, would you? That he does it right away. He owes him one. Right? Oh, okay. Well, that kind of explains that. That makes sense. And now there's there is some backstory, some reason that Simon really knows. He's seen almost the 3 marks of the church. This is not going to be on Jeopardy, I promise. I don't think I've ever seen Greek on Jeopardy. The 3 marks of the church are kerygma, which is proclamation, preaching or teaching; koinonia, which is fellowship, often table fellowship; and diakonia, from which we get deacon, which is service or mission. He's already seen all of that. Jesus' proclamation, he's had table fellowship with him. He's seen him serving, healing. He's seen it all. Everything but, of course, the resurrection. But we won't tell him about that just yet. Don't want to spoil the ending. So that's the way in which Luke is very different from Mark and Matthew. There's way more backstory. Now, Luke does share with John's gospel this story of the miraculous catch of fish. In case you're thinking, I've heard that before, but I thought it sounded a little different from what I remember. It's because it appears in both of those gospels. There are 2 major differences. The big one is where you find them in each gospel. When you look at Luke, it's toward the beginning of Luke's gospel, as he's calling the first disciples. Peter, James, and John. Andrew gets thrown in for good measure. And in John's gospel, the story happens toward the end. It's framed as a resurrection appearance. And instead of the call of Peter, it's the recalling, the reinstitution of Peter. After Peter has denied Jesus 3 times, Peter's recalled at the shore. And then it's followed in John's gospel by that beautiful, Jesus says to Peter 3 times, "Peter, do you love me? Feed my lambs. Peter, do you love me? Tend my sheep. Peter, do you really love me? Feed my lambs." And so there's 3 affirmations to cancel out the 3 denials. It's kind of this beautiful thing. The second thing that's different is the details of the miracle itself. So in John's gospel, Jesus is on the shore, and Peter, Andrew, James, and John are out a little ways in their boats, and Jesus, not recognized by them, calls out, "Children, you haven't caught any fish, have you?" I don't know if it was that tone, but it sounded fun. And they go, "No, we've been fishing all night and haven't caught a thing." And the mysterious man, a.k.a. Jesus, calls out, "Put the net on the right side of the boat and see what happens." They think about it for a brief moment. What the heck, might as well. Pull the nets out of the port side, throw it over on the starboard side. Immediately, fish are just drawn to the net. It's so heavy that it begins to sink the boat as they're pulling it up. Now, rather than assuming that I understood ancient fishing practices, I did a little boning up this week to figure out what was typically the way that folks fished. And I was actually very surprised. The most typical way that folks fished on the Sea of Galilee was they went a little ways out from the shore. They had a long net that had cork stuff on the top to help float and little lead weights on the bottom to help the bottom sink down so that it was there. And then they would take the boats back to shore, and that's usually why there were 2 boats or more. They fished as partners, and they would bang the water with their oars, and they would drive the fish toward the net. They were fish herders. And the fish would swim away scared, and they'd think they could get through the net because it was, a hole, but then they'd get stuck. It was kind of a plant-based mesh, and they would stick themselves in the net. And once they'd done that, then they would pull the nets up. In the miracle stories, they don't have to do any driving. The fish just come. There's a whole evangelism sermon in there, right? That disciples are not driven by fear, but drawn by faith. They find Jesus attractive. They're not fleeing from the wrath to come. They're fleeing toward the grace. So the fish, and I wonder, this is just my educated guess, don't swear by this. I'm thinking, I've always wondered, what's the difference between the left and the right side of the boat? I'm wondering if normally the way the boats were positioned, if they would put them on the left or the port side, and that way then they could take the boats to the shore and they do the driving. And if they put the nets this way, they'd have to go all the way around the net to get to the other side. I don't know if that's true or not, so maybe it was counterintuitive to them to do. In Luke's gospel, Jesus says to them, put out into the deep waters and let down your nets. Put out into the deep water. Now, where are the fish going to hang out in the lake? The fish hang out in the shallow water. Why? Because the sunlight gets to the bottom of the lake there, and it grows plants and food and shelter. And if I were going to pretend I had a degree in marine biology, I would tell you that the biodiversity was greatly enhanced. So there are not going to be very many fish out in the deep water. They got to be thinking, why on earth are we going out to the deep water? I think maybe more than anything else in this whole story, it's the deep water that tells us the most about God and Jesus and what the mission of the church is. Why does he send the disciples out to the deep water? Why does he send us out into the deep water where the sun doesn't get all the way down? To bring some light to the darkness. To help people open their eyes to see where God is, to help us open our eyes with compassion to see the needs of our neighbors. Why are we driven out to the deep water where there aren't many fish? To show that in a world where all we can think of is scarcity, that there is abundance everywhere, even in the deep waters. When Jesus went to feed the crowd, he needed 5 whole loaves of bread, but he only needed 2 fish. Jesus sends us out into the deep water to find those who are lost, to find those who the world considers least and last. And Luke will follow that up 10 chapters later in chapter 15 with 3 uniquely Lucan parables. Jesus sends us to find the lost coin, the lost sheep, the lost child. Jesus sends us to find the lost fish. 1 fish, 2 fish, red fish, blue fish. I died for you, fish. What would it be like for all of God's people to realize that we are being sent out into the deep water? What would it be like for us as a congregation to put out into the deep water? What would it look like for you?